Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Alex Fernando, and I'm a part of Techopedia, your hub for all things business IT. We provide insight and inspiration to technology decision makers, IT professionals, and anyone else with an interest in technology. Today, we're diving into all things cybersecurity. Cybercrime is expected to cost businesses $10.5 trillion annually by 2025, according to Cybersecurity Ventures. Taking steps to ensure a secure enterprise network is more important than ever. Leading us in today's discussion is Clive Matters, Chief Technical Officer and Assessor at Security, a UK-based cybersecurity certification body. Mr. Matters has over 25 years experience in the IT industry and has built up an extensive repertoire as an enterprise solution architect, delivering managed ICT support services, cybersecurity certifications, and advanced security solutions to help improve the cybersecurity maturity of businesses across the UK. But before we get started, a few notes. Today's discussion is being recorded, and we'll be sending out a link to the recording shortly after the end of the live presentation, so you can listen or re-listen to it whenever you like. We also want to make this presentation as interactive as possible, so please enter your questions into the Q&A section as we go along, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. With all of that said, I'll turn things over to you, Mr. Matters.
Hello, many thanks, and welcome everybody. So moving on, today's webinar, what we're going to try and cover for you today is what is a cybersecurity framework, the benefits of aligning with a cybersecurity framework, which is something I feel is very important, introduction to some of the common frameworks that we see, managing compliance, and then at the end, some questions and answers. And hopefully you'll find the content of some interest to you today. I'm going to try and keep it as high level as possible, trying not to get into any specifics. And of course, my area of expertise is more UK focused. So whilst all frameworks are based on similar grounding, there might be some differences between countries where you may be looking at the different frameworks. So we can get into some of those in the Q&A, but there may be some questions that we'll need to come back to you on, because I always like to give the best possible advice. So starting off, what is a cybersecurity framework? Well, I kind of try to say to people that it's broken down into a set of things, really. It's a set of guidelines, best practices and standards, and really designed to reduce the risk that your organization, company or whatever faces from cyber threats, but also to help you increase the security posture of your organization, hardening the infrastructure, servers, laptops and things like that, removing vulnerabilities, primarily focused around patching and similar things like that. Generally, just trying to make it harder for a threat actor to gain access to your networks, infrastructure, systems and services. I kind of like to think of a framework a bit like the Eiffel Tower, really. The framework being the metal, ensuring that the correct design of the tower remains standing in the bad weather and under a load of people standing on it. Cybersecurity frameworks very similar in the same way, but the weather this time and the load is threat actors, malware, exploits, and similarly. If we set the grounding correct, like the Eiffel Tower with the steelworks itself, hopefully we can sustain attacks and all of the general low-level commodity attacks that we see on a daily basis, and that's where the frameworks kind of help us. There's several types of frameworks, and we can cover all sorts of different things with those during the course of this evening, but risk-based, looking at the organization's risks and threats. That's one of the types of frameworks, very much focused on risk. A program framework, looking at the cybersecurity program within the organization and how you're delivering and that kind of thing. And finally, control, looking at the organization's control frameworks. All of those together or individually form many of the different global frameworks available in your country. So lots there. Common frameworks that we see quite frequently, GDPR, Cyber Essentials here in the UK, the ISO standards, NIST and HIPAA, and we'll talk a little bit about those later. So why do we need them? Well, I kind of say when I talk to people, somebody somewhere getting paid a lot more money than I do has spent a lot of time and money considering all the threats that we've seen in the last month, 6 months, year, 2 to 3 years. And they've developed a framework of measures that will help mitigate those risks. So when we implement these frameworks, we're looking to reduce risk, and somebody has spent some considerable time analysing all the data from across the country, across the world, globally, and more locally. So, that's quite useful. Who develops these frameworks? Well, it depends where you are and what they are, I guess. But the NIST framework, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, for example, that was born out of an incentive from President Obama back in 2013. And that's a standard that we've adopted some of here in the UK as well, to a certain extent. ISO 27001 from the International Organization for Standards, ISO. They established the 27,000 series. They've added some new ones recently, actually, to that, which are not only about the controls that you have, but more technically getting into how you're delivering them rather than just policies and process. So that's quite good with the ISO 27001 and now 27002 and some of the others. ISO's quite common across the globe, so that's probably a more well-known one. HIPAA, again, not something here in the UK, but something in the US. But again, here we take similar sort of standards in the National Health Service, looking after patient data and things like that. So again, a good framework there, HIPAA, but similar standards across other geographies. PCI, quite a common framework again for the payment card industry, just ensuring that certain protective measures are put in place in any systems that are dealing with credit card data. And again, just tells us how we should do things, how we should do them properly, and how we mitigate the risks that have been seen over a period of time. Here in the UK and anywhere that is dealing with European data, we have the General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR, taken into law in the UK, even though we've left Europe, as it were. And that's designed to protect the data of European-based citizens. And that puts quite a lot of onus on organisations to make sure that data is managed correctly and looked after, but not so much now in terms of the organisation, but the data subjects. So those people whose data we hold, and much more focused on looking after the data for them than just us as a business. And in the UK, we have Cyber Essentials. That was a basic standard developed by our National Cybersecurity Centre, NCSC, which is part of GCHQ here. And they looked at commodity-based attacks that were occurring over a period of time. They did some research and came up with a standard here that delivers about an 80% reduction in risk for commodity-based attacks. Recent study has brought that to about 70%, but again, a great standard, very easy to deliver, all based on controls. And again, it's about reducing the risk of those day-to-day commodity attacks. I think my main thing with frameworks is, or any cyber controls, is not making yourself a target. None of us want to be a target, but raising yourself up the tree so you're not low-hanging fruit. If we do the things that remove us from the easy drive-by attacks and make ourselves harder to attack, then most of these script kiddies and those that just want to attack for the fun of it, they'll move on to somebody that's an easier target. How do we show compliance? Self-assessment questionnaires. Many of the frameworks have kind of self-assessment solutions that you fill in. You answer the questions appropriately and they score you appropriately. And as long as you're honest about what you're actually answering, that should still deliver a good solution for you. I tend to look at certifications, and we often find here when we're marking certifications that sometimes what IT believe and the company directors believe don't actually always align. Not through anybody actually, lying about what they're doing within their assessment or anything else, but just a misunderstanding and translation between departments. So doing these self-assessment questionnaires and things like that, you've got to be absolutely honest, and you need all the right people involved to make sure that you get that right. Of course, otherwise there's the external auditing. So the likes of ISO and others, including our Cyber Essentials here, when you go to the later stages, they all require external assessments after the self-assessment, just to kind of prove that you are able to comply. And again, with that one, I always say, make sure you're honest. If you're honest about what you're doing, you'll get the best out of the frameworks that we're using. So what are the benefits of aligning to a framework? Well, I think for me, Some people have got regulatory requirements. There's no choice. You've got to align to those. PCI DSS, HIPAA in the US, similar things like that. So some people, no choice. You've just got to have these frameworks. The key reason for me, though, has always been, how do you know you're doing the right thing? So you may or may not be a cybersecurity expert, and you may or may not have access to all the data that tells you what the current risks are, what the current threats are, and the things that we're exposing our networks and our systems and our people to. You may have access to all that data, in which case you can do some number crunching and work out what's the right thing to do. But generally, somebody else has worked that out for us, and the frameworks are where that starts. So they've looked at the risks, they've developed some controls, and if we implement those, we know we're doing the right thing. So for me, first of all, doing the right thing. Everybody, and this is kind of every vendor that I ever come across, and certainly from when I was working more in managed services, managed IT services, every vendor had a product that was the best. Their product could solve everything you can imagine. But how do we know? If we don't have a framework or something similar to align to that tells us what it is we should be doing, how do we know the product that we're buying, or the solution we're buying, or the services that we're buying are actually going to deliver what we need in our business to make ourselves protected? So key thing there is, how do we know? How do you know what you need to do to reduce your risks? So again, the same thing. The frameworks are designed there to tell us what to do, how to reduce our risk. And if we don't follow a framework and something happens, we're out there. Then we've got nothing to hang our hat on to say we did this. We've got this framework in place. We are as secure as we can. So we've now had a breach, and we're having to tell our clients we've lost their data. We've got some reputational damage now. If you look at that in terms of the UK and the GDPR, we'll talk about it in a minute, but the GDPR fine of 4% of your annual turnover is probably irrelevant in comparison to the reputational damage, if you're a small to medium enterprise, of loss of clients. They tend to, we tend to find with the breaches that I've worked with, where they're very, very large organizations, people kind of accept that, oh, well, it happens, people get breached. And they carry on working with those organizations. They change their passwords and they move on. Smaller organizations, though, very quickly lose clients, where the client moves to somebody where they feel their data is safer, or their own organization is safe because they're working with somewhere else. The other thing I think as well, when you're working in the business and you're in the business, and rather than necessarily working on the business or stepping back from the business, it's very hard to see what risks and issues you might have. So having a framework to kind of refer to and then look at your own organization in alignment to that framework allows you to kind of understand whether or not you are really doing things in the right place, or spotting holes, spotting issues and vulnerabilities and risks within your organization. They're always easier to see when you're not even in the business. So for me, to spot things in somebody else's business is a lot easier. Being in the business yourself, it's very difficult to sometimes see what to somebody else is very obvious. So again, for me, a framework allows us to help with that. And the other thing is, if you've got a framework and you're aligned to a particular framework, you're able to advertise that to your clients and anybody else via your website, via certificates, whatever you need, tenders and things like that, just to show that you are compliant and what you're compliant with. And when it's a fully understood framework in your geography, people will understand what it is you've done to achieve that. So they have an inkling of what sort of security you've probably got in place or not, and that kind of thing. So again, you can prove what you've got, but also in the event you have a breach, and if I liken that to the UK here, if we have a breach here, we have to advise the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, that we've had a breach, we've lost some data, or whatever has actually happened. They'll come and have a look at our solutions here now and see what it is we're doing to protect the data that we've now lost. First of all, how do we know what we've lost? But how do we know we've been breached? And what were we doing to prevent that? Can we prove that we've done something appropriate to prevent our data being breached? So again, aligning to a framework and having the relevant documents, controls and policies in place you can prove to a regulator who's going to come and see you after the breach or during a tender, for instance, that kind of thing. You can demonstrate that you're compliant with the standard, and therefore, what sort of controls you've got in place. And I can't stress enough from the clients that I've worked with breaches that having something to refer back to when a regulator turns up and say, right, this is what we've done and we've followed this and we've delivered best practice is absolutely critical. So framework-wise, one of the ones we mentioned loosely earlier was GDPR. The European Union passed the General Data Protection Regulations designed to protect the data of EU citizens. So this is for anybody that is working with or holding data, processing data for EU-based citizens, and they must comply with the GDPR, either via some very specific contractual clauses or directly, depending on where you're based and that kind of thing. And again, this one, I always come back to. The infringement can result in fines of up to 4% of a company's annual revenue. Is that really significant? I don't think so for everybody. It's more of an impact to lose clients and the actual cost of your business having lost some data. And back to just very quickly data loss before kind of moving on again. If you're working with larger organizations, having a framework allows you to prove to them that you've put the right controls in place. If you're working with those large organizations and a breach occurs, they're obviously going to look at you first because they always believe that the breach is never theirs. And the smaller organizations are always going to be easy to blame, potentially. You've got far less money to spend on cybersecurity than the likes of Microsoft, for example. So your security probably will be as good as you can afford, but not necessarily spending as much money as the larger vendor. So you don't want to get caught out with them dropping all the blame on you. So again, being able to prove things, I think, is quite key. So GDPR focus on privacy and data protection for EU citizens. It was quite interesting when I was just double checking some numbers on this, that in the year that it was launched, GDPR, back in 2018, the ICO here fined Google $50 million for a breach, which was very early on. I do know the ICO here, I think, have struggled a little bit keeping up with everything because they had so much work to do with that. But certainly people are getting fined, and they certainly come and investigate over here if we've had a breach or a loss. ISO 27001, so International Organization for Standards, ISO, they established the 27001, which is, as I say, more about governance, really, and building a security management information system. And they've now added the 27002 standard, which is more actual control based. So with the two together now, they work quite nicely as a kind of a governance set and an actual control set. So I quite like those two together. As the stats say, there are over 45,000 valid certificates, but internationally known. So unlike Cyber Essentials in the UK, where some organisations outside of the UK like that, in the States, who knows about Cyber Essentials? And likewise, over in the States, you've got some controls and some frameworks that we just don't know or use here in the UK. ISO 27001 and 27002, and indeed many of the other ISOs that cover different areas are internationally renowned and known, and something that we look for over here in the UK for organisations we work with, typically the 27001. And we have NIST, so one that I'm not something I deal with on a daily basis. So this is not one that I'm as hot with, as it were, as the UK and international standards generally. National Institute of Standards and Technology developed the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and the Risk Management Framework in 2013, and it's great. So again, we've looked at this here for a number of organisations that work multi-jurisdictional, as it were, and I found it's a great framework as well. Based on three core components of the core, implementation, tiers and profiles, but the core, I think we've kind of put there the main areas: identify, protect, detect, response and recover. So based around the whole thing really. So lots to cover in one standard, and again, unlike the ISO where we've got two things to kind of develop a standard that I think can deliver everything we need, a lot of it in one place here, which is great. And again, used a lot in supply chain, so that's something we see. Compliance with the NIST framework, though, is voluntary. So I suppose most frameworks, even over here in the UK, are mostly voluntary. And we find what's quite interesting is certainly with the Cyber Essentials here in the UK, government don't legislate the fact that you need a framework in place. There's this kind of feeling that they can't enforce costs on people and shouldn't enforce costs on people. What that results in is less kind of cyber security in place, and sometimes organisations, I think, spending more money on cyber security than they really need to, because they haven't aligned to a framework, back where I was talking earlier, where they know what the right product for them is because it's designed to align to a framework, and they've just thought, we need to do something, we'll go out and buy product X. Product X costs a lot of money, but it seems to say it does everything. That sounds great, we'll put that in. Often with no idea how to configure it properly, so it maybe isn't doing all that it needs to be doing. But sometimes just spending a huge amount of money that is disproportionate to what it delivers for that organisation. So again, I think frameworks just help with that. NIST seems very good, but again, they're all kind of voluntary. They've all got various costs. PCI DSS, I think, is the only one that really kind of gets enforced as such in GDPR. They don't have a cost to entry necessarily, but they do have security requirements that you need to kind of tick off to show that you're in alignment. We then got Cyber Essentials. Obviously, that's my favourite one here in the UK, backed by the UK government, but again, voluntary, so it's not enforced on anybody. It's primarily designed for the small to medium-sized business, so it comes in at a very low price point, which is great for the really small organisations where they can do a self-assessment and understand if they've got the right security in place to reduce some of their risks. So that's really good. And then it takes a step up into a fully audited assessment, slightly more expensive, but again, a really low entry point, which again allows an external assessor to verify that everything they've got in place is compliant, secure, and delivering the best security they can have for their money. It's not based on products. So a lot of this isn't based on products. ISO 27001 is not based on product, nor the other standards, but they tell you the kind of things that you need to do in an organization with regards to, for instance, monitoring logs and reviewing logs and things like that. So it points you at the products that will do that particular thing. So if you know that you need to have log monitoring in place because the framework says that's what you need, then you can look at products that are specific to do that and how you do that, how frequently you should do that. There's a standard, for example, that says, you should be looking at log files to look for breaches and things like that on a weekly or a monthly basis. And I've seen people think that means that somebody can manually look at a log file. Yes, okay, in theory they could, but anybody in IT would know the amount of log data that we've got, that's not really possible. So we need solutions. So therefore, when we're buying solutions, do they align and deliver other aspects of the framework as well? Is there something that allows us to do this very cost effectively? So that's, again, the Cyber Essentials here in the UK. HIPAA, again, not something I come across very much here in the UK, but we have similar sort of standards of looking after health information and compliance with here the NHS and the government requirements around health and the secure backbone that we use here in the UK to transmit that kind of data. In fairness, we still use fax machines over here for sending certain amounts of data because it's believed to be very secure. So I think the NHS is still the biggest buyer or purchaser of fax machines over here. But again, health regulations, critical everywhere. And again, it's a great framework. So it's just telling us here, what do we need to do to be compliant? It lists the controls out for us. We can check our own systems. Are we delivering those controls? And if not, how do we deliver those controls? And then look at buying appropriate services or products or solutions to make sure we align and not just spending money on any tool because somebody has told us it's the best possible tool. So managing your compliance, how do we kind of go about this? So we've talked about frameworks again, but I think I tend to say with everything that I talk about with any client that I talk about is do something, don't do nothing. So to start with, how do you know what risks you've got, what vulnerabilities you've got? Everybody talks about pen testing. Pen testing is a bit more targeted generally. My suggestion is always start with a vulnerability assessment. Understand what you've got and what vulnerabilities are, and that can be done relatively cost okay, because it's not a lot of human interaction. So pen testing tends to be more expensive because there's lots of people doing things, they're attacking you in effect and trying to find your weaknesses. With a vulnerability assessment, we put some tools on, we can do some scanning, we can understand what the vulnerabilities are within your infrastructure, give you a list of things to fix. And then generally after that, that's when we say, right, let's look at pen testing for any remaining risks. So complete a vulnerability assessment and make sure that is aligned to your standard. So if your standard, as our Cyber Essentials says, everything above a 7 scoring risk needs to be remediated, then that's what we do. If it says you can wait a month, then that's what you can do. But you need to look at the standard to get some idea of what you're trying to deliver and work out how you align to that. Allocating time and resource to implement the controls is pretty key. So you can have the frameworks, you've got all of the instructions on how to deliver, what to deliver, how you're going to do it, but you've got to have time to be able to do so. So the ISO 27001 requires a reasonable amount of time to create the policies and processes, but also time based on getting your staff and teams trained and understanding those policies and processes and what they do, how they do it, making sure it's real. And resource wise, I always say with any of the frameworks is involve the staff, not the management. There's always the management concept of they know what they want done in a particular way, but the staff have already found a more effective way of doing it, or a way that isn't exactly what management wants, or how they want it done. So you've got to involve them to make it appropriate, so that when you actually instigate something, it doesn't cause a problem in the business and slow things up. The framework shouldn't make things harder. It should just make it harder for a threat actor and not our own teams to be able to work. And it doesn't need to make it hard. Engage with a certification body for frameworks. So whichever framework you're aligning with, find somebody that knows the standard inside out, how it's deployed, how it aligns, and how you get to the end game of getting the certification. They'll be able to help you through all the problems. So when you've got things that aren't compliant, they can tell you how to address those things that are not compliant, if you've still got to keep them. So we come across quite often with the Cyber Essentials here in the UK, clients with older equipment that just has to be kept for legal reasons. In the aerospace industry, some old testing gear or whatever has got to be maintained, but it's running very old operating systems. So we have to look at how we isolate those and protect those and keep them off the main systems, so they don't introduce vulnerabilities into other things. Knowing what you've got is key as well. I'm still waiting here for to read one day that an organisation's been hacked through the fridge. In Internet of Things, IoT, bigger thing now, lots of people in the business buying technology and plugging it in without any consideration of talking to IT or security. So we could be introducing more vulnerabilities on a network, which could be exploited by an attacker, and IT don't know anything about them, so they're not looking to update them, secure them, or keep them safe. So I'm no doubt at some point we will see somebody attack through the fridge. Engaging with certification bodies can help with those kind of things as well. But the key thing I think for me is to remember to involve everybody from all departments, beyond IT and beyond management, so that everybody understands what you're trying to achieve and why it's important, but also their role in that, so that you're not fighting with each other. You're implementing a solution that locks a certain thing down, and that prevents them working on a daily basis, so they'll find a way around it and circumvent it. That just doesn't work for security. So you need to work together, so you understand that if you're stopping something from one side, how's it going to work on the other side and deliver something suitable. And then finally, you've got to monitor and maintain the solution. It's no good deploying a solution that is going to work for you and then you never look at it again. You've created this compliance policy and the documents and all that kind of thing. You've got the tick in the box. Great, so we'll forget it now. We'll park it until the next assessment audit. And then next year, we're dragging it all out again. looking at it and going, you know what, if we really read this and did this and delivered it, it'd be absolutely fantastic. So you fiddle with it for a fortnight before your assessment, try and get everything done, and an auditor comes in and finds what he's been presented with, and off he goes again. You really need to use these standards to monitor and maintain the compliance. So hopefully, you know, that's come across. But again, my key thing here with all the frameworks and all of what I've talked about with cybersecurity is do something, don't do nothing. It doesn't have to be expensive. There's lots of entries into doing the right thing with the frameworks. In fairness, you don't even have to buy in all the consultancy for the framework. You can read it, look at it, find out what you need to do yourself to improve things already. But do something. Don't just sit back and hope that nothing will actually happen, because it will. And that's me talking on about frameworks. But I think the key thing I just wanted to get across there is they are really good. They are not onerous, or they don't need to be onerous. They don't need to slow the business down. They can be very effective. You've just got to work together to deliver these frameworks. And when you choose the right framework for your jurisdiction or wherever you are, or what's right in your business, you know, once you've got that there in place, you can then get your other tools, other systems and services to align with that. So you know you're spending, you know, the money in the right place and getting the right outcomes.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Matters, for that. Now it's time for our Q&A section. If you have any questions, please share them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom console, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. And feel free to make use of Zoom's anonymous feature if that makes you feel more comfortable. With that, let's get started with the first question. Do you have any examples of issues where framework use may have helped or prevented a breach or issue occurring?
That very good question, actually. I've just literally been working with a client who came to us for some assistance. About 10 weeks we've been dealing with a breach that they had, and it's quite interesting that a couple of the basics of cyber essentials here. Again, it was a UK-based client with some international links. But some very basic cyber essentials controls. And if you remember from my earlier slide, it's about an 80% reduction in commodity-based attacks, so the easy attacks. If they'd had cyber essentials in place and followed the process around that, they actually wouldn't have been breached. So that's really quite interesting. In terms of cost to them, probably in about the region of about $3 million they've spent with downtime, fixing it, client issues, and all the forensics and investigation and other things. Not with me, I hasten to add. But yeah, very expensive for them and their insurance company. And if they'd had the framework in place, they would have reduced their risks.
Thank you. Our next question here. What advice would you give managed services providers? Should they push frameworks onto their clients?
Another interesting one. So as a managed service provider of many years, I think it's a difficult one, because managed service providers, if they're suggesting frameworks and services, often don't think about the costs that come back at the managed service provider. So I think they're really good to get a framework into clients so that you're helping them improve their security. I mean, from a managed service provider's point of view, it probably means they're ending up buying some services as well, which is always good. But when you put a framework in, a lot of the frameworks are IT orientated, and then the client comes back to the managed service provider for assistance and support in deployment, configuration, and even answering the questions. And often the managed service providers have forgotten to think about those costs that can't really be just absorbed in their monthly fees. So my advice would be, yeah, I think it's great to talk to clients about compliance standards, but do remember yourselves that there's a cost to you of helping deliver these things that often the clients think is just a quick question here and there, and you end up losing quite a lot of money in that what is free consultancy, because they think it's easy to do when it isn't necessarily.
Thank you, Mr. Matters. We have one last question here, but if there are any burning questions you have and you want them answered by Mr. Matters, please enter them in the Q&A. So the final question we have so far is, do you think frameworks should become mandatory in the future? And indeed, do you believe they will?
And another good question there. I kind of would love to think that certain frameworks would at a low cost point. I think the Cyber Essentials isn't here in the UK, but is a low cost point. So it's not mandatory, but I think it kind of should be, and it could be, because it's really quite low cost, and that would really raise the cybersecurity standards of all SMEs that use it, but would also point them in the right direction for the right advice. Government here, whenever we talk and hear from them about this, always say they can't push additional costs onto small businesses. So, and I absolutely see that. And when we talk to some of the regulation authorities for like solicitors, legal firms and things here in the UK, again, the same applies. They don't want to push additional costs out to their members. So they kind of advise that these things are a good idea. I'd like to think as things go on, they'll become more mandatory, mainly because other organisations will be requiring them in the supply chain, so there won't be a choice.
All right, thank you very much. And with that final question, that brings today's event to a close. Thanks to all of you who attended and to Mr. Matters for sharing your thoughts. As mentioned earlier, we'll be sending out a recording shortly. If you have any questions, feedback, or thoughts on topics we should cover next, please don't hesitate to reach out to us through any of the links we're sending in the chat now. And if you or your company are interested in sharing some of their expertise with Techopedia as the audience, you can reach me directly at alex@techopedia.com.